Good evening, everyone. I am happy to have you here. My name is Kesha Rogers, and I want to welcome you to this evening's proceedings and our panel discussion on the question of solving our flood and hurricane threats, great projects for a great America. And today, before I introduce my fellow colleagues on the panel today, which will include Dr. Hal Cooper, a civil engineer who's done a lot of work on infrastructure projects around the country and has an extensive background, which I will introduce shortly, and also Brian Lantz, Mr. Brian Lantz, who's been a collaborator with myself and a member representative of the Executive Intelligence Review, and also working alongside with me on projects with the LaRouche political organization. And I'm just delighted for the discussion that we're going to have tonight, because what you will find is that we are in a moment right now where the question of the identity of mankind is on the table. The idea of how we actually solve the threats confronting mankind is not a question of, is there enough money to do so, or is it the question is the political will to do so. And many of us are here because we realize that a year ago at this time our lives were completely transformed and changed. And with Hurricane Harvey, the worst hurricane on record history in a very long time, that dropped almost over 39 inches of rainfall in a very short period of time. The wettest tropical cyclone in the record history in the United States. And Harvey became the nation's third largest economic disaster. Now, many people have been told that Hurricane Harvey is a thing of the past. People are moving on. Lives are being rebuilt and recovered. And I think a lot of people in this room, including myself, can say that that is absolutely not the case. That when you look at the conditions of lives of the people here in this state, in Harris County, that the poverty levels are abysmally worse. The conditions of people being out of their homes are still a serious issue and concern, a threat. Those individuals whose lives were taken by Hurricane Harvey, and it wasn't just Hurricane Harvey. What I'm going to show you in a moment here is that I'm going to say what a lot of the politicians are not saying, that the result of not building the projects that should have been built a long time ago has been the result of criminal negligence, has been the result that has caused people's livelihoods to be lost. And today, there is an article in the Houston Chronicle which is titled, "A Year Later, Harvey Still Distresses. Survey finds recovery is uneven with many area residents still struggling." And I want to read the beginning of this to you as it says, now 19% say they are having a hard time controlling their temper. 10% are taking a new prescription drug to treat mental health issues. 8% are drinking more. And it's probably more than this. And it says that they quote a number of people in the Chronicle who are discussing what they're going through almost a year later, with the father from Meyerland who has 3 children and whose house in Meyerland took 20 inches of water, and now he and his wife and children live in a 2-bedroom home, which as massive reconstruction still continues. And there's more stories like this. I can go on and on. But what I'm here to tell you and to emphasize is that we have to demand that we're going to put an end to the records of despair, of refusal to answer the call of putting forth the infrastructure that's absolutely needed to not only address the flood crisis, or as people are saying right now, we can put a Band-Aid over the crisis, over the put a Band-Aid in order to solve the problems. But this is not going to solve it. We need a total overhaul and restructuring of our physical economy and economic system. Now, what I want to do is, let's pull up the first slide. 1 second here. Okay, here we go. This is first of all, I think it's important for us to look at the history here and the record of the devastation of events, of flooding, hurricane events in Texas since the conception, since the founding of Texas, going back to 1837. You've had many floods of the Buffalo Braes Bayou system, downtown flooding areas. And if you look at it, as it says here, we're talking about from the year of 1837 to 2017, where we just had the recent event of Hurricane Harvey. This also doesn't talk about the last 3 years of flooding as some experience of the tax day flooding and so forth. But what you can see is that there have been over 75 flood events in the past 181 years. Now, some people try to say that the recent flood events have been a cause of the increase in climate activity or man-made climate change. But you really have to question that if you look at how long this flooding has been going on, where the city of Houston, Texas, the terrain that we live on. And when you hear people say that we cannot solve the flood crisis, we can only mitigate the flood crisis, we can only minimize the flood crisis, because that's what we've been told. That, for instance, there was some record in the Houston Chronicle and by individuals who have said that the flood bond that's now being proposed, which let me just say this, I'm not opposed to the flood bond that's being put forth right now, the $2.5 billion. I think it's a Band-Aid, and I think that we need to think bigger. We need to think about the next 50 years of infrastructure development. We need to make sure that the heartache and the devastation that people are still living through today, that those who suffered under Hurricane Ike, that those who suffered under Hurricane Rita, with the hundreds of losses there, and so forth and so on, and the losses that have been ongoing because of our failure to act. When we have the resources right here, the mind power, the will, if the American people, if the people of the state of Texas say, we don't want hush money to just shut up. We want to make sure that our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, the next 50 years will not have to endure what we had to endure and what those who have come before us had to endure. So when I hear people saying, well, this will mitigate the problem, we'll have $1 billion here, or a little bit of money here for flooding, we're saying that possibly the bond could bring about $1 billion per year for 10 years. Not opposed to it. But as you're going to hear from our speakers here, and Mr. Lantz is going to go through what we were able to accomplish when we thought big, when we didn't have financial constraints, when we had programs such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And in just a moment here, I'm going to show you how that program of Franklin Roosevelt transformed not just the region of the Tennessee Valley area, but the entire country. And this program had the funding that it needed and paid itself back over and over again as the project continued to develop. And so when people say there's not enough funding, and we look at what we have been funding over so many years now, the bailouts on Wall Street, the criminal drug cartels, the financial looting, and we cannot build the infrastructure that's needed to save lives and keep people alive, I say that's unacceptable. And so, or you have people who are proposing smaller issues. Why don't we just build retention ponds and in the residence and fix our drainage systems? All of these things I'm not opposed to. They need to be done. But we need a top-down approach. And this is what is not being discussed at any of these meetings. If you have people who are running around talking about, well, we can sort of minimize and limit the flooding, or talking about, we're going to make sure that those people who were flooded out of their homes, well, you probably didn't know how to get the right kind of insurance. So you probably didn't know the difference between when you have insurance for if your pipe bursts in your home, or if you have insurance for if a massive flood and hurricane disaster hits your home. Well, how ignorant and how do they think the American people, do they think you are? Because the question is not a question of whether or not the insurance companies, who, when you have a devastation of this nature, can afford or to pay back the home, and buy back the homes of all of the people who lost their homes in the flood. But the question is, more so, we're not talking about we're not talking about the question of an insurance racket here, that the insurance companies are making thousands, millions of dollars, when in the first place, instead of saying I have to have insurance for this or have insurance for that, I have to have insurance for flooding, I have to have insurance to cover if my landlord doesn't have insurance, all of these things. No, what we had to have is we had to make sure that we prevent. It's called preventive care. It's like health care. We don't have preventive care. We need preventive care when we're addressing our infrastructure crisis. And so let's take a look for a second here at when we thought big, when we thought about the future, what we were able to accomplish. Can you move that for me, Mike? Okay. This is a quick 4-minute video that I want you to take a look at here. And I have a few words to say.
The Tennessee Valley Authority. During the 1930s, there were few regions of the country that were worse off than the region known as the Tennessee Valley. Where is the Tennessee Valley? How did the New Deal help this area? The area known as the Tennessee Valley includes portions of Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Kentucky. For years, this region was far behind the rest of the nation in many areas of life. Electricity, running water, sewers, and proper sanitation were all elements of our modern life that were sorely lacking in the Tennessee Valley during the 1930s. One of the major goals of many New Deal programs was to help modernize the South and improve living conditions in those states. The most notable of these New Deal programs became known as the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. The TVA's goal was to build hydroelectric dams throughout the area, which would bring electricity into thousands of homes. Eventually, the TVA would construct and maintain more than 30 hydroelectric dams that provided inexpensive power to millions of Southerners. In 1933, it was estimated that only 2% of homes in the Tennessee Valley had electricity. By 1945, this number had been improved to 75%. Bringing electricity to the region was extremely important. Not only did home appliances and electric lighting make life easier, but there were other benefits as well. Factories and other businesses were now able to locate in the region and employ thousands of workers. There were also health benefits to the increased availability of electricity. Better lighting meant improved eyesight and a reduced risk of accidents. Electric refrigerators allowed Southerners to keep food longer without it spoiling. This meant they could purchase food from the grocery store rather than depending on homegrown produce and dairy products. Electricity also meant that Southerners could purchase what the rest of the nation had been enjoying for the past decade or more, a radio. The radio proved very meaningful in the isolated Tennessee Valley region. It helped Southerners feel more connected to the rest of the nation. They could now listen to the same news and radio programs that people from New York to Los Angeles were listening to. Aside from providing electricity, the TVA was also concerned with soil conservation. The organization promoted the use of fertilizers and crop rotation to improve soil conditions. The TVA also had programs to improve fish and wildlife habitats, control wildfires, and replant forests. The TVA was not always popular. The construction of the hydroelectric dams caused more than 15,000 families to lose their homes. The areas were flooded to make lakes and reservoirs. Also, many Southerners were suspicious of government officials. Therefore, the TVA had to recruit local citizens to speak to their neighbors about soil conservation techniques. Other New Deal programs were created to help fight diseases. Hookworm, pellagra, malaria, typhoid, and diphtheria had long plagued the South. These diseases were spread through poor sewage and sanitation systems, which allowed germs and bacteria to spread rapidly. New sewer systems in major cities helped reduce the number of deaths caused by diphtheria and typhoid. New water treatment facilities also improved the condition of drinking water. Swamp drainage in South Carolina resulted in a 16% drop in malaria cases, and mosquito eradication efforts helped reduce malaria-related deaths by 66%. There were similar successes and reducing the number of cases of dysentery, hookworm, and pellagra.
So, as I said, since 1959, the TVA has been self-financed, and its bonds have been guaranteed by its power revenue. And what you saw there is that the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and what it did was not just a flood mitigation. It wasn't just a patch over. They actually showed that the problem could be solved. If you look at the Tennessee Valley Authority today, if you look at the Tennessee Valley area, do you have the massive flooding? Why would you want to do something that is going to continue to bring about the same results? Well, you don't have, what the Tennessee Valley Authority showed is that the problem can be solved. It can't just be bandaged over or mitigated to make it less pleasant. But what we also have to look at is that what it also showed is that it was a transformation, should we say, of the lives, of the living standard of the population, the increases in the lifting of the population out of poverty. Things that we take for granted now, the use of electricity, running water, the ability to have appropriate farming, contour farming was introduced. Those things that most of our society doesn't realize leads to the ability for you to be able to function every day as you do and to have the living standards you do. But we've been moving backwards, because if you look, as I showed in the first diagram of the 181 years of flood events, well, there was a program for Texas to be modeled on the conception of Franklin Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority, and to really address both flooding and the drought crisis in the state of Texas. This was being proposed in 1968. There is a very extensive report that I would encourage people to read and take a look at. If you look at 1968 plan for Texas water systems, these plans were not fully developed. The proposal didn't pass. But what it looked at is that the proposal didn't just look at short-term fixes and mitigations. It looked at, if we put forth the implementation of water development systems, reservoirs, dams, it had a whole list of projects that should have been built. But it looked at the development of these projects in a 50-year perspective. So this program actually addresses 1968 plan looking forward into the future to the year 2020. And at that time, when they were addressing this program, they were looking at the projected rates of population growth for the state of Texas and the growth in productivity for Texas had these programs been developed by the time 2020 hit. And so the projected growth of population in 1968 was estimated for the state of Texas to be around 30,500,000 by the year 2020, which would have been more than 3 times the population of 1960. And made the point that the capability for this great increase in population growth was going to have to come with industrial and agricultural expansion, provided aqueduct water supply systems and suitable and available systems of water management and transport. And I can tell you, we're not where we need to be in the year 2018. We're moving backwards because we don't have that foresight into the future. We cannot have small thinking, bandages, and people saying, well, we don't have the money to do it, so we'll take what we can get. We have to demand, one, a complete change in our political structure that says the livelihood and the well-being of the American people, the people of Texas, have to be defended and protected. And so, as we listen to our other speakers here, before we go on to our other speakers, I want you to think about this, because we cannot afford to lose more precious lives. And in just a moment here, I want to give a dedication. I'm dedicating this event and what we're going to be doing to ensure that more people don't have to die needlessly because of lack of action, because of negligence, that people can advance in our state to have a higher standard of living, where lots of people who are still out on the streets now because they've lost their homes, and people are saying, you just got the short straw, nothing can be done. We have to demand an end to this because something can be done. And as someone who, like many people, is still living through this nightmare of Hurricane Harvey, after a year of losing my parents in the floods, with my sisters and brothers having to be called, and myself and my husband and I, to be told that my parents, my father and stepmother, are no longer with us. And I have dedicated myself in this fight. This is not about politics. This is not about left versus right. This is not about my campaign. This is about dedicating one's life to ensure that we will stop the abuses and the negligence which have led to needless losses. And I want to take a moment before I turn it over and introduce our guests to have a moment of silence, because over 98 people or so lost their lives in Hurricane Harvey. People who gave a lot. People who were passionate leaders and givers in their communities, as my parents were. And we have to demand right now that we want better for our future. We want better for our children, better for our grandchildren. No one should have to go through this. And no one should have to live through the people saying that nothing can be done. Because we have to do what's needed. We have the power to put forth the infrastructure and put forth the solutions, and not just on a local level, as you're here we can actually unify this nation again in a way that's going to rebuild lives. And so I want to dedicate to those individuals who have lost their lives in the storm, and to those individuals that are still going through, those people, as I said before, who are still out of their homes, those individuals who have to find hope again in knowing that the future lies in providing greatness once again. And so, just one moment, please. Thank you. So, I am optimistic about the future that we will create. And I'm optimistic about building this nation to greatness once again, putting millions of people to work in productive jobs. And I'm happy to be working alongside and to have someone who has dedicated most of their life, good portion of their life as a civil engineer. Dr. Hal Cooper was integrally involved in major technical and economic feasibility study for the proposed Alaska-Canada rail line. He's been involved in the Bering Strait tunnel connection. He's been involved in a number of his specialty is in rail development, but also working on projects such as the promotion of the North American Water and Power Alliance. He's going to be discussing today the national outlook that we need on both solving our flood and our drought crisis, because remember, it wasn't long ago that we were dealing with the devastating drought in the state of Texas, and continue to do so in many parts of Texas. So I'm not going to prolong any longer, because I think you will really be inspired and get a sense that we have to have a can-do attitude once again, and we have to think big in this country. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Cooper, and let me just get him set up here. One moment, please.
Why don't you just give him the microphone to
Is everything working and now?
Yes.
Okay, testing 1, 2, 3, right? Maybe 4. Kesha, thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. It's great to be back in the great state of Texas again.
Is the mic on?
It's on, but you have to hold it a little closer.
Is it now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Better, yeah.
Good. Okay. Well, it's great to be back in Texas again. I'm very honored to be here. Kesha asked me to come down and talk about what we need to do to fix up the water system in the state of Texas, both in terms of where we have too much and also where we have too little, because we have plenty of both. And they're in different regions of the state, and the solution to one eliminates the problem or reduces the problem in the other. And I think that's something that we have to really be thinking about for the future. And among leaders of the state, Kesha has been unique and her willingness to address the fact that we can't just address the present and the past, we also have to address the future. And that's why we're all here tonight. You can give me the next slide, please. Kesha has made a proposal, which I think is very sound, and that has to do with this idea of the North American rail and water Belt and Road Initiative. North American Belt and Road Initiative, NABRI. That is what needs to happen. Now, unfortunately, as Kesha has very clearly pointed out, the thinking of most people in the United States today is one of insularism. It's one of small thinking. It's not big thinking. It is all about the present and not worrying about the future. And let's deal with the problems of today, but nothing more. And if we don't deal with the problems of today, we're really behind the eight ball. And of course, the problem just magnifies in the future. Kesha has proposed that we actually develop a network of rail, transportation, electric power, water, and a network. And this is really based on what's being done in China through the Belt and Road Initiative, which was formerly called the One Belt, One Road, which is a network of rail and other infrastructure throughout Europe and Asia, the Eurasian continent, and also being extended ultimately to Africa, to South and Central America, and ultimately to North America too. And interestingly enough, probably where the most resistance is going to be is right here in North America. Next slide, please. Is this the same one?
No, it's the second one.
Okay, it is basically the same thing, but what is important here is we want to tie in the Bering Strait between North America and Asia, that through a tunnel. I was able to do a feasibility study a number of years ago on this particular project, and I've been in Russia several times where there was a great interest in the Bering Strait tunnel, but unfortunately in North America there's virtually none, and the establishmentarian groups want it kept that way so that we all can maintain a low IQ view of the future. Like 40 and below. And in the South, if you go back to the previous view, you see going down to the Darien Gap, which is between Panama and Colombia, and that would tie in Central and South America. Now, the Chinese are working with the government in Panama and with the government in Costa Rica right now to develop a high-speed rail corridor between Panama City, Panama, and San Jose, Costa Rica. And of course that can be moved to the north. There's also what is called a CPAC. It's Spanish for Central American electric transmission corridor, which would run from Panama up to Guatemala. Now, with the new president in Mexico, President Emmanuel Lopez Obrador, I think we're going to be seeing a movement forward on infrastructure with Donald in instead of Obama, where Obama was trying very actively to prevent infrastructure development in Latin America, whereas I think now we have the case where maybe this can change, but it's going to take the Chinese to bring it about in conjunction with the local countries. And the United States needs to be a part of it rather than sitting on the sidelines. Next slide, please. Now, we also need to be talking about water. Now, this is sort of a new version of the previous NOWABA, North American Water and Power Alliance, where we would be taking water from Canada and moving it down into the United States and even a little bit into Mexico, going through the central and western parts of the United States. That area in between with all the red colors is the Ogallala Aquifer, which is in the process of being drained, and that problem is most severe in the state of Texas. I'll be discussing that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. Next slide. Now, this is more of a close view, and this would show water courses A couple of you before the meeting tonight came up to me and said, well, we need to do something in California. Well, California cannot solve its water problems today with the water in California. Water is going to have to come from somewhere else. One of the alternatives is the Pacific Ocean. But desalination of ocean water is not inexpensive. And as a result, we're going to need to bring water from Canada. Now, there's a very large river in northern Canada called the Mackenzie River, and it runs from Alberta and British Columbia up into the Arctic Ocean through the Northwest Territories, and its flow is 30 to 40% greater than the Columbia River, which runs through the Pacific Northwest. And we need to bring the water down to serve California, to serve Arizona and Nevada, to serve Texas and the Great Plains. There is, in fact, some of you may be aware that in the state of Nevada and the Lake Mead, the level of the water in Lake Mead is now within 2 feet of the level which would trigger emergency responses with mandatory major reductions in water available to the states. And of course that most directly affects Nevada, California, and Arizona in particular, because they're very vulnerable because they don't have a lot of additional sources of water. California at least has an ocean, whereas the others do not. And this is very much a factor. Next slide, please. Now this is actually a route showing where you would take water from Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories and bring it down to the northern end of Williston Lake in northeastern British Columbia, which is a lake that's 280 miles long, 5 miles wide, and 300 feet deep. Now, there is presently 2 hydroelectric dams on the outlet of the Williston Lake in what's called the Peace River in northeastern British Columbia, west of Fort St. John, British Columbia, which has about 5,000 megawatts, and that's the major source of power for the province of British Columbia in Canada. Now, there's going to need to be more. There's what's called a Site C, which will add another 1,100 megawatts downstream from the 2 existing dams below Williston Lake. But then going to the south, you would need to build a water aqueduct for about 300 miles, which would need to be a pipeline because it gets cold enough up there, water freezes. And then going into the upper Columbia River, and then going all the way down to the Dalles, Oregon, and then ultimately being pumped to California. But also you need to come across the Rocky Mountains into the Missouri River Basin, and then down to North Dakota, and then from South Dakota to Texas, and particularly with the recharge of the Ogallala Aquifer. Next slide, please. Now, this is a view of the previous Nawapa, bringing water from Alaska and the Northwest Territories and the Yukon Territories down through Canada to the western and central United States. And also, I had put in some earlier, I worked with a gentleman, one of the LaRouche people down in Mexico, Manuel Frias, who actually had proposed some aqueducts in Mexico and in Central America, and so we combined these together. But this is a view of the North American water power lines, and sadly, the only organization in the United States who is willing to advocate, let alone mention, the North American Water and Power Alliance is a group right here tonight. All the officialdom is, we don't want to hear about this, we don't want to talk about it, let's perpetuate the status quo, and let's make darn sure we have the blinders on our eyes and the earplugs in our ears. And that is the established thinking today. And Kesha is exactly right in what she's saying. Next slide. Now, this is a chart from the Texas Water Development Board for the 1968 Texas Water Plan. And notice the population of Texas increased from less than 10 million in 1960 to an estimated 31 million in 2020. And we're going to hit that within 1 million people. Now, in addition to that, It's not what's already happened in the past, which we can't do anything about. It's what's happened in the future, which we can do something about. We estimate, there are different estimates, depending on who you believe, that the population of the state of Texas is going to increase by another somewhere between 10 and 20 million people within the next 20 years. Now, that's about equivalent to the increase in population between 1960 and 2020. Now, where are we going to put the people? Well, we have plenty of land here. This is not New York City. Or the state of Washington either. But where are we going to find the food for them? Where do we find the water for them? How are we going to provide the electricity for them? And the state of Texas rightfully believes in economic growth and development. But where it's falling down is, how do we deal with the implications of that growth? And that is exactly what Kesha Rogers is talking about. You've got to address all the problems, not what you just want to address. And that's something that's sadly missing in today's population equation in terms of people's thinking, or more importantly, lack of thinking. And as I said earlier, the only group in this state, if not in this nation, that's really looking to address these problems is right here in this room tonight. Next slide. This shows different plots of irrigation, and I just took the chart directly. How many acres of land could be used for irrigation? That assumes you have the water available. And those are different scenarios. The Texas Water Plan attempted to address that in 1968. How many of you remember the election campaign of 1968 when this was on the ballot? 2 of you? Okay. I wasn't living in Texas at the time. In fact, I was living in Corvallis, Oregon at that time, working with the pulp and paper industry, so I did come down to Mills, Texas occasionally. But John Connally, the former governor, who was really probably at the tail end of the progressive era in Texas, if not the United States, in terms of thinking, because of his friendship with Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson, really was pushing for a major expansion. And they were proposing that we were going to be taking water, which was shown in Kesha's earlier slide that I'll show in a couple of minutes, to bring the water out from either Arkansas or Louisiana, plus what was in East Texas, and ship it out to West Texas. Now today, I think the political reality is that it's going to be difficult to get water from the east to the west that's going to come from other states. From the Mississippi River, it could. Now, it's also possible we could be bringing it down from the north, but that was not a part of the original plan. And it went down because of the cost, and also because of the electric power requirement of 8,000 megawatts, which at the time was being proposed to come from coal-fired power plants, and people objected to the air pollution. And also, the states of Louisiana and Arkansas venomously fought having their water diverted to Texas. So that caused that plan to go down. Next slide. This is your water, groundwater, surface water, and total water use projections from the Texas Water Development Board from the Texas Water Plan report of 1968 for 1960 through 2020. And 30 million people, 30 million acre feet a year. So you can just about project how much additional water we're going to need for every million people additional we have. And if we have 15 to 20 million of people new in the next 20 years, we've got a big problem with water, big time. And we have to address it. We can't just sit on it and let everybody take their actions for themselves. And Lord knows we need to get rid of this phony baloney about no interbasin transfers of water. This is designed to restrict and prevent economic growth and development at all costs. And guess who's behind this? Our good friends in London. Next slide. Now, these are the major aquifers of the state. The Gulf Coast and Coryza-Wilcox aquifers are most important to us here in the Gulf Coast area. And the Carrizo-Wilcox actually has different zones where you have freshwater and brackish saltwater. And then you have both freshwater and saline water aquifers out in the western part of the state. Most important of which is the Oval aquifer. And that's the one that is running out of water in Texas because it's being pumped out and it's not being replenished. And that's one of the major things we have to address in the infrastructure here in the state of Texas. Next slide. And these are the smaller aquifers that are also there. And that was all part of this original Texas water plant. Next slide. Now this shows all the aquifers together in Texas. And you can see where water is, where groundwater is and where it isn't. There are places out in the western part of the state where there's precious little groundwater. El Paso is one area that is particularly vulnerable, but really, you have large areas of the state of Texas that are very vulnerable in terms of their water supplies. That affects agriculture, it affects industries, it affects municipalities and people. So we have to be very cognizant that we cannot just frivolously misuse the water. And I don't know how many of you are aware, but I didn't know it until I did the background research for this proposed presentation tonight, but there are presently 35 water desalination plants operating in the state of Texas today. And that is about, I understand, 140 million gallons per day of water, and we use 30, wait a minute. No, it's less than 1% of the total use of water in the state at this point. But it appears to me that we're going to see a much greater use of desalination of the brackish groundwater in the state. In El Paso, there's a 25 million gallon a day plant already in operation. It's been in operation for several years. Kesha has actually toured the plant. She's had a chance to see it. I have not, but it was interesting to read about it. And this plant not only takes the water and has a desalting unit with reverse osmosis. It takes most of the salt out, and then fresh water comes out, and then you have this concentrated brine salt solution. And what they do is they're now processing the brine salt solution to concentrate it even further, so you get another 15 or 20% of the water is able to be used, and that's as a cooperative effort of the El Paso Water Utilities Department and Fort Bliss Army Base. They're working cooperatively to bring the water to the El Paso area, which it badly needs, as you know, any of you that have been there. Next slide, please. Now, this was a very simple schematic flow diagram of the early Texas water plan, where there was water coming from Mississippi, from the Mississippi River in Arkansas and Louisiana to Caddo Lake and others in East Texas, and then pumped out to the west to El Paso and to the High Plains, and then also another line going along the Gulf Coast, assuming they had a water shortage. In some places they do, and of course when you go to South Texas, south of Corpus Christi, you really are in that condition. Next slide, please. These are where the surface reservoirs are in East Texas. These are important because if you're going to be concentrating water and you take storm water, you have to put it someplace. And that's why they need to make use of at least some of these reservoirs. These are already in existence primarily, and they're with the existing surface waters, and water would need to be stored in the ground and then pumped into these reservoirs, and then a lot of it would ultimately be sent out to Central and West Texas in the future. I'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide, please. This is Lake Travis in 2011. I don't know how many of you remember it, but it's the opposite of what we had with Hurricane Harvey. I can remember in July of 2007 being in Austin when it was terribly dry. There were no bugs at night, they were all dead. And I can remember going out to Lake Travis and seeing that Lake Travis's lake level was down 65 feet from its normal level, and on the channels you had boats on dry land because there was no water there. Next slide, please. Then was the Brazos River. And this was taken in 2011 also out in west central Texas, northwest of Waco. And you can see how dry this was, and the Brazos River, for all practical purposes, was dry. It didn't have any water in it. It was a very pathetic situation, and of course it's very harmful to the agriculture there and also to the municipalities. Next slide, please. Now, the opposite. Kesha very clearly described the flood situation in Houston, and of course her family was very much adversely affected by this, and other people were, and some of them continue to be, because we have not taken the steps that are necessary to properly correct and help the people who need help. There's been too much stalling. There's been too much putting things off for the future. There's been too much make excuses for not doing what we need to do. And sadly, that has happened in Houston. And a lot of you are certainly much more aware of this problem than I am, but it certainly is a problem. And this was taken during a time when the Hurricane Harvey, you can see all the rain. Next slide. One of the problems was basically shut the rail network down on the Gulf Coast. And all those lines with the concentrated red, blue, and green were the railroad lines that had to shut down. So basically you had a situation where a lot of the freight and some passengers couldn't go anywhere because the railroads were flooded. And that was damaging. And of course you also had this problem to a certain extent with some of the highways as well, because they flooded as well. Next slide, please. Now, here is a chart of water use by state in the United States. I saw this in one of the magazines on electric power. And California is clearly all by itself. But right behind it is Texas. And then others go down from there. Florida has a lot. Believe it or not, Arkansas does, because of irrigation. And New York, large states in population, large water use. And it's broken down by sector. Next slide, please. Now we get to the Ogallala Aquifer. This is a map showing where the Ogallala Aquifer is. It goes from the southern part of South Dakota to West Texas. And some of the areas in the Ogallala Aquifer, like in Nebraska, there's been relatively minimal loss of the groundwater level. They manage the water carefully, but more importantly, they got the Platte River going through, and a lot of it recharges the Ogallala Aquifer, which is not the case in the states to the south. And the most critical problem is in Texas. In the Panhandle, in the Permian Basin region, and the aquifer is being dried up, and it's being pumped out, and it is not being replaced, and it's going to lead to a complete loss of the agriculture in time, as well as adversely affecting the municipalities. Next slide, please. Here's another view of the Ogallala Aquifer, showing the same things, and the areas in brown and yellow are where the maximum depletion of water is occurring or has occurred. Next slide. Now, I proposed water conduits to take water that would come from Canada down through the Missouri River, and then pumping it from North Dakota south to Texas along the Great Plains. And the advantage of taking it out of North Dakota is your elevation is relatively high, so you don't have to pump water as much uphill. And in fact, a lot of it you can just run a canal down from places in western Nebraska all the way down to Texas, where you're basically at 3,000 feet elevation, or approximately that. But that's one possibility. Next slide, please. And here is showing the chart of the Ogallala Aquifer and also the Permian Basin. And you'll notice that the southern part of the Ogallala Aquifer and the Permian Basin are right there together. And they're not necessarily at the same depth, but they're there together. And and all the oil production is causing a lot of salt water to be generated that's going to have to be dealt with, and so that it doesn't completely contaminate the fresh water. In the Permian Basin region, less than 6% of the water is for energy production. 3% is for the municipalities, and all the rest is for agriculture. But because I understand the rainfall in many of the areas out there is 2 to 3 inches or less this year, and they basically aren't able to grow crops this year. It's a serious problem. And the only way they're bringing up the water is to take it out of the overall aquifer, which has not been replenished, and it's a very big problem. Next slide. And this is where you would have a central corridor of water to take the water from Canada down to actually coming from Saskatchewan and Alberta as a part of that system of taking water out of the Mackenzie River and moving it down to Texas. And the reason to take it out of the Mackenzie River is it goes out into the Arctic Ocean basically unused. Its flow is 30% to 40% greater than the Columbia River, and the water goes out. And the environmentalists are all saying, well, there's too much fresh water coming into the Arctic Ocean, and it's helping to cause melting of the ice. Well, maybe we should take the water out and ship it to Texas and ship it to California. Next slide. And Kesha didn't say it, but in addition to the lack of foresight thinking, where is the common sense? I mean, it isn't there. Like, we can't connect dots together, okay? And here's another view of it. Now, this is basically a modification of where the old Texas water plan was, incorporating taking water from the Mississippi River, and that would be primarily at a place called Lake Providence, Louisiana, which is in the northeast corner of Louisiana along the Mississippi River. It's to the northeast of Monroe, Louisiana, and pumping it out into Caddo Lake on the Texas-Louisiana border, and then having water go to Dallas, some going to the southwest, a lot of it going out to the Panhandle as a modification of the earlier Texas water plant. Next slide, please. And here's another view of the same one, just showing one conduit taking water from the Mississippi River. Now, the problem is the states of Louisiana and Arkansas fought the earlier plant. I understand there was an effort to take water from the Toledo Bend Reservoir, and Louisiana fought it because the part of the lake was in Louisiana, and you need to bring water from the Mississippi. However, you don't want the intake to be south of Baton Rouge. Why? Because that's where the petrochemical plants and the petroleum refineries are, and you don't want all that organic contamination in your water. Next slide. And here's a more comprehensive chart of how we can have a distribution system of water throughout the state of Texas and to some extent into New Mexico, and where all these links. And you'll notice a line along from in the Houston area down to the south near Laredo, and to serve the Rio Grande Valley as well, because that's an area critically short of water, and also of water of acceptable quality. Next slide. Now, this gets us back to that chart, the map that Kesha showed from the original Texas water plan, showing where water was being pumped from northeast Texas out to the west, to the Panhandle, and to South Texas. And I think that's something that is a possibility, but the difficulty is going to be, I think the states that, other than Texas, are going to be very resistant to moving their water, and that may be that we have to desalinate more water at the coast and also from the groundwater. Next slide, please. And here's another view of the same thing, just clearly showing where the individual flow areas are in canals and where water is being distributed to. Next slide. And here's where there would be a more extensive network, which would include reservoirs and where the individual rivers and river basins are, so that you would have the ability to move water. Now, whether that's going to happen or not, that's another question, because I think what we may end up with is Texas is deciding to do desalination is probably going to become more and more important, and we won't bring the water so much in from outside the state, and we'll also have to do a lot of desalination from the Gulf of Mexico, and that means nuclear power plants along the coast, which are outfitted with desalination facilities just like they're doing in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. Next slide. Now, flood control. Kesha talked about the need for flood control. Barriers. This chart shows, it was from a report that was done by the Texas Water Board, and it shows barriers along where the island is to the north of Galveston, along the Gulf of Mexico, to try to protect the areas. Now, that's keeping water from surging in, but unfortunately it doesn't do anything about rainfall, and that's another concern. Next slide, please. Now, here's another chart showing that instead of protecting only or primarily the outer island, would be along the bays. And that particularly would be West Bay and southwest of Galveston down towards Freeport, and the same kind of barrier but along the north spit there. But that, and also you'd have to, of course, there in that particular chart there's protections around Texas City and Alvin and so on, but not up towards Houston. Next slide. Now, this one shows a much more extensive system where you have the barriers along the Galveston Bay, both on the east and the west side, and a protection all the way from right across from Texas City, all the way up through the Mark, all the way to Houston, to protect the ship canal, and also on the West Bay along down towards Freeport. Now, again, it's preventing surges, but it doesn't do anything to guard against increased rainfall, and that's one thing we have to do to be concerned about, and that means you're going to need to have underground storage of some kind, and this by itself is important, but it's not going to solve the whole problem, but it will solve the problem of surges. Next slide. Now, here's a map in East Texas showing bringing water over from the Mississippi River, and then to Caddo Lake, and then at the upper level of the Sabine River, and then going into the Toledo Bend Reservoir, and then a map or channels taking the water down past Sam Rayburn Reservoir through East Texas and northwest of Houston, that would conduct water to the South Texas, and also going out to West Texas as a part of the earlier Texas water plant. Next slide, please. And here's another basically a clarification of that same map, showing the line across Louisiana and the lines going down to South Texas. Also a lower area north of Orange on the Sabine River, and then going into the Houston area, and then to the west through Sam Rayburn Reservoir, and then ultimately down towards San Antonio. Next slide, please. And this is Brian's map for Toledo Bend, and taking water over to the Sam Houston Reservoir, and then going out to Lake Somerville near College Station, and then having water going down to South Texas. And that would be one other definite route that would be needed for water to protect and supply Houston and the areas of East Texas. Because we need to not only worry about too much water in Houston, but we also need to worry about too little. Next slide. And this is a network for water aqueducts, an extensive network if it was ever to be built in East and Central Texas to take water to and from all the major river basins in East and Central Texas. Next slide, please. And then here's power generation, and that would be something that, whether we're going to use natural gas or coal or wind or solar power, would be another issue. We have limited hydroelectric power generating capacity in Texas, unlike in, say, the state of Washington, but we do have the ability to move water around, and we will need to consider that in the future, including to the Rio Grande. Next slide. Now, what happens when we have all this water in the eastern United States and we don't have any out in California and in the West and it's burning up because of fires? Well, one of the things we could do is have a national system based on what we're talking about for Texas, where you have storage reservoirs. You take the water and collect it and then put it in pipelines and ship it out to other parts of the country. And that's a possibility. But again, it takes what Kesha said is imagination and thinking and foresight for the future. Next slide, please. What would the cross-section look like if it was done under a railroad? Put the pipelines 100 feet underneath and pump water. And I show a water transport pipeline to move water, and also the possibility of either maglev or hyperloop transport for underground transportation at 1,000 miles an hour. Next slide. And here's our a map showing where the existing 35 water desalination plants in Texas are located, just in case any of you didn't know. I have a chart a table showing the capacity of all of them, and most of them are less than 1 million gallons a day, but some of them are not. And the El Paso one is the largest one, but I think it's going to be the model for others. And there's now an organization called the Texas Desalination Association, headquartered in Austin, that's going to be having its annual meeting on the 13th and 14th of September in Austin. And I think, realistically, this is probably what so many of the areas in Texas are going to have to rely on, is desalination, which is going to be relatively expensive, and it's going to require using quite a bit of energy, whether it's natural gas or whatever else. But it's going to be necessary to do. And we can get water from the Gulf Coast, which we could control by using desalination down to the coast. And then we wouldn't have to be in the business of fighting the other states over who's going to get the Mississippi River water or whatever, because I think that's going to be much more difficult to do. With the exception of the fact I think we're going to need to, as a nation, address the question of what to do with the Ogallala Aquifer, because the Great Plains is so important in terms of the food supply for this country. And you know, we can only go so long ignoring water problems and not run into a problem with food supplies and food costs. That's very important. And what Kesha said is the thinking of people who are completely ignoring this, what the implications are going to be in advance. And food supply and food costs are very much a function of water availability, and water availability at a reasonable price. Next slide. And I also, we have the question of what do we do with all this water from oil and gas production? And it's a lot in Texas, and it's going to get to be a lot more. And we're going to have to deal with that. And one of the things we can do is recover the salts and make hydrochloric acid out of it and use that for oil recovery, but also produce more fresh water. But I think that's going to probably be more expensive than treating the groundwaters. Next slide, please. And then I showed where the existing power plants, marine coal are, and of course then from the aspect of natural gas, there's plenty of those plants. And then also you have very large amounts of wind and power resources out in West Texas at a very inexpensive price. The only problem is it only works when the wind blows. And solar energy is only good when the sun shines, which means you got to have storage. And that's something that's going to be very important in the future. Next slide. Now, this is a schematic flow diagram of what the, as best I was able to ascertain for the El Paso plant, where you had a desalination system for the water, taking 2,000 or 1,500 milligrams per liter water and reducing it down to 500 milligrams per liter of fresh water coming out, and then taking that 10% of the water that's brine and recovering 80% of that water, and then reclaiming that, and then taking the chemical, the salt, and turning that into hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide, plus several other chemicals. And they have a chemical plant there that's recovering a number of minerals from the water residual from the salt processing. Next slide. Also, here's a if we want to solve the problem and continue to use coal, we could use those plants that otherwise are going to get shut down, put an air pollution control system, which my father and I developed some years ago, and the electric utility industry didn't want to have anything to do with it. And why? Because it generated a profit, and that affected their cost structure, their ability to raise rates through the Public Utilities Commissions. Next slide. Now this is a chart of where all the oil shale formations are in the United States. There's quite a number of them, as you can see. And of course, the Permian Basin in Texas is by far the most important of all of them in the United States. Next slide. And then here's a chart showing where a rail line down the central corridor is and where these oil formations are. And of course, that's also, we're also showing where the NOAPA system water would be bringing water to. Because water is important as a part of energy production, but much more importantly, and in far larger volumes, agriculture. Next slide. Permian Basin and pipelines. Very complex place, producing about 3.5 million barrels a day of oil now, and it's getting to the point that everything is backlogged. Their capacity, they've got to increase pipeline capacity, and then I'll address that in just a second. Then go ahead, next slide. Now, this is a chart showing in Texas and New Mexico how much crude oil is being produced in the Permian Basin now and how much is going to be produced in the future. And it's going to basically double by 2025 from what it is now. And most of that will be in Texas. Next slide, please. And then here's where all the rail lines are connecting and the pipelines. So you can get a feel of what the transport infrastructure is. And of course, you got Interstate 10 and Interstate 20, plus a lot of the roads. Next slide. And then employment. There are something like 450,000 people working in the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico now on oil and gas production in those regions. And that's due to increase to over 1 million by 2025 if the present production trends continue. And then what are we going to do with all the people? Where are we going to put them? How are we going to get water to them? And then how's that going to affect agriculture and a whole lot of other issues? And water being a very important component of this. Next slide, please. And then this is another map of the Permian Basin showing the pipelines, the railroads, and where the different zones in the Permian Basin are as far as where the oil production is. And of course, it centers in Midland and Odessa out all the way to Pecos, and it goes over to near Big Spring. Next slide, please. And then this is saltwater generation. There's a big article today in the Wall Street Journal about people having an opportunity to make profits from processing the water, and that's by pumping it back in the ground, which does absolutely nothing. We're going to need to desalt that. And that's what's not being talked about. And that involves energy and it involves cost. Next slide. Now, I'm proposing that we build a pipeline for water from Corpus Christi and pumping water from the surplus regions down on the Gulf Coast out to Big Spring in the Permian Basin, and then use that for either agriculture or for energy production. And there are presently, that's just being talked about, that's my proposal, but more importantly, there are 3 oil pipelines that are now being proposed to be built from the Permian Basin down to Corpus Christi that have an aggregate capacity of about 3 million barrels a day of oil, which will be almost enough to handle the future surplus, assuming that they get built and get permitted and all the other things that are associated. Probably it will be. And then natural gas, another pipeline, and those will all flow from uphill to downhill, and then separately you'd have water being pumped out. And of course you could put taxes on the oil and gas transport to help pay for the water transport upstream. Next slide. Now here's an article from last week's Engineering News Record that's discussing these new pipelines that are going to need to be built and what their capacities are. And while they're talking about oil pipelines, nobody's talking about water pipelines, but we need to be doing both. Next slide. Now here's the elevation chart going from near 2,800 feet at Odessa down to 10 feet at the Corpus Christi. And there's a big drop right near San Antonio in elevation, so that helps the oil flowing downhill. It also means you have to have a lot more energy to pump the water uphill, and there's a lot more water being pumped up than there is oil flowing down. The oil just happens to be more valuable, at least at the moment. Next slide. And here's another view of that same system, and there are two alternative routes, one north through Floresville, through San Antonio, and the other one coming south and the point where they diverge is in San Angelo, and one of them goes down through Jordanton and Three Rivers, and whereas the northern one will go through Beeville, and they'd all end up in Corpus Christi. And there'd be a gathering system for water, taking water from Houston and from Brownsville, and so you can pump it all up to the Permian Basin. Next slide. And this is what the system would look like if you did it horizontally. Have a freeway, have railroad tracks, have a CO2 pipeline, most importantly the crude oil pipelines, the gas pipeline, and a water transport aqueduct and electric power generation, all on the same corridor, probably between 200 and 300 feet wide. You put it all in one place and get it all done and get the help of the oil companies, which is going to be necessary politically to get it done. Next slide. Now, the Eagle Ford Shale is in South Texas. It runs from College Station over to south of Del Rio to Eagle Pass, and that's going to be another major source of oil production, and that goes down into Mexico, only it's called the Burgos Basin there, and that's a major oil production place as well. Next slide. And then here's high-speed railroads and water pipelines, or higher speed railroads and water pipelines as networks, and where they could be built on the same right-of-way. That would be helpful, but that's not always possible. Next slide. And here's another map of the same railroad lines, just the railroads themselves. And now, next slide. Now, this gets us to something that is now coming up, and that is Latin America. Our future in Texas is going to be intertwined with Mexico and with Central America, and we have to have economic development. Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador has proposed that they have to have a major infrastructure program in Mexico and then also going down into Central America. There's already studies underway for a high-speed rail between Panama City and San Jose, Costa Rica, and that could be extended up into Mexico. And I personally think when we get Kesha's North American Belt and Road Initiative, NABRI, it's not going to come from the north, it's going to come from the south. And with the Chinese involved with these countries, including just this past week, signing an agreement with El Salvador, which is not only going to bring more prosperity but fewer gangs, then that's very much important. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. That it's very important for Central America and Mexico to be closely working with Texas where it's appropriate, and that's particularly involved with rail transport and probably energy. Some of those countries have plenty of water. Maybe they can ship some of it north, but of course northern Mexico is dry, whereas southern Mexico is quite wet. And you have plenty of rain south of there in the tropical regions, but there is always the issue of water to deal with. Next slide. And here is a view of power plants in Mexico. There are lots of them, and most of them are oil-fired. They're converting a lot of those to natural gas at this point because natural gas is so plentiful, and we're shipping them natural gas too. Next slide. And then here's a map of the railroads in Mexico, and particularly centering it in Mexico City, and then going down to Guatemala. Next slide. And then here's a more detailed map of the railroads in Mexico, and they've all been privatized now with private companies. Most of them are doing relatively well, but we have to have better transportation for rail and hopefully high-speed rail as well. And it may be that will presage what happens in Texas. We just don't know. Next slide. And then here's a map showing what an integrated rail network would look like in North America, Central America, and South America. And I think that's the last slide, if I'm not mistaken.
Another one.
One more? Yes. This actually was a proposal done published in 1898 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to build a rail network throughout the Americas. And it got squashed after McKinley was assassinated. And isn't it interesting that the same games that were being played then are being played now about let's do everything we can under the table to restrict and prevent economic growth and development. And to counteract that, that's why we need Kesha Rogers in office, and we need her program on the North American Belt and Road Initiative. And I thank you.
Thank you so much. And that's when we thought big, and we have to start thinking in this way again. And I know the first thing that probably came to people's minds is, how are we going to pay for that? Who's paying for that? Can we afford to pay for that? But the question is, can we afford not to? Whose tax money, how much tax money does that cost? Well, what you're going to hear in a moment here is, as I bring up our next speaker, Brian Lantz, is going to discuss the implications of a credit system, how we actually fund for the future, great projects, and why it's absolutely critical that we actually start to fund and develop these types of projects that are going to actually address the needs for decades to come. So, and after that, I do have a few announcements. But go ahead, Brian. Thank you very much.
Okay. See if I can move this here. If I understand this correctly. Okay. Jesse Jones. How many of you know who Jesse Jones is? Fair number, good number. Jesse Jones from Texas.
Houston.
Yeah, from Houston itself, yes. We've got Jones Hall here as one memento. And his foundation and all the rest. But the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, created in 1932, while Hoover was still the President of the United States, became the vehicle for financing the massive infrastructure programs that rebuilt the United States out of the Depression. At a point where we were broke, and nobody was arguing that we had a bunch of money to spend, we managed to spend, apparently, a lot of money. But more importantly, what we did is we put a lot of people to work, and we produced our way out of the Depression. So it starts at the federal level, the capital of the United States. But we're going to get to Texas as well, more directly. If I can move this thing around, Mike.
Yeah, press page down.
Yeah,
Oh, okay. I have to push harder. Okay, there's Jesse Jones on your left, and of course Franklin Roosevelt and his wife. This is a picture taken, I believe, right here in Houston, Texas. Now this picture, let's see, Mike. I'm not sure this is.
Okay, well, maybe we got disconnected.
Okay, can I just tell you the movement?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. Right after the storm, right after Harvey, this article appeared in the Houston Chronicle. One of Houston's greatest philanthropists worked with government, not against it. And this was an op-ed in the Sunday Houston Chronicle. The date's up there, September 16th, written by this guy Finberg, who's a historian for the Jones Foundation. And this article was saying, look, this is what we did before. We did it for the whole country. Jesse Jones, right from here, led it. He became the head of the, even before Roosevelt, became the head of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, and saw it through the 1930s and right through World War II. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation financed sewer systems, railroad refinancing. They pulled the railroads out of bankruptcy across the United States. During World War II, you had steel companies that wouldn't build steel mills because they figured, hey, if I build the steel mill, the war could be over, and then what do we do with the steel capacity? So the Reconstruction Finance Corporation financed and built steel mills and turned them over to the steel companies to produce steel for the war effort. I mean, I'm just trying to give you a sense of how enormous this effort was. It was over roughly equivalent to $1 trillion today, was spent by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Spent, but in the form of credits that went out to finance all of these various projects. And also they gave away a lot of money. If you want to talk about money, they created credits for all kinds of projects across the country, including for the war effort. So go on to the next. Here's a meeting of the board of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, a little bit posed, but anyway, just so you get a flavor of this. Go on to the next. Here's clerks. They're typing out contracts, interest rates, tabulations of how much had to be paid every year and so forth on various projects. Go on to the next. So what set in motion this process, this recovery of the United States out of the Depression, the Great Depression, was the institution, the passage, with support of both Republicans and Democrats, of the Glass-Steagall Act, named after its sponsors in the Senate and House. And Glass-Steagall was the first step because it carried out bank separation. It said commercial banks to operate with insurance, they're going to be insured by the government. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was set up through the Glass-Steagall Act and so forth, can only lend commercial loans. They cannot be involved in stock options, stock brokerages, the insurance business. They cannot be involved in what we would today call financial derivatives, which is a $250 billion a year financial market. It's the global casino, the Casino Mondial. None of this was all outlawed in 1933 because it brought on the 29 crash, right? Speculation, massive speculation, not by a bunch of poor people, trying to make ends meet by, hitting it big in the lottery, but Wall Street, right? And London and so on and so forth. This was the bubble that crashed. And so Glass-Steagall was put in. Glass-Steagall was the law of the United States up until 1999 when it was repealed with the help of Phil Gramm, among others, signed into law by Bill Clinton. But it was the law of the land up until 1999, and its repeal guaranteed the crash of 2008. And since it has not been replaced, it's not been reenacted, we're now guaranteed that we're moving into another financial crash right now. So this was the first step because you had to sort the banking system out. You had to salvage the underlying commercial banking feature of a banking system to provide credit, the flow of goods, and all that comes with it. Go on to the next. All right, so metropolitan areas. These are the big, here it calls the monster clusters, mega cities that are developing around the United States. Not necessarily all for good reason. We have a lot of people, as you know, in Texas, we got, people, West Texas, the Panhandle, these towns are drying up and blowing away because the economic activity is contracting. There was no recovery. But nonetheless, we have these mega cities developing. Go on to the next. You'll see the point. The Texas Triangle here. This is the centerpiece of Texas in terms of its population growth now and what can be expected over the coming years. And this is where we've got to think very, very big over the next 50 years. This is where most of that population growth that Dr. Cooper was talking about is going to happen. The triangle roughly between Fort Worth and Dallas over to San Antonio and then east to Houston. That triangle, you can think of it, as bounded by the freeways, but a little more broadly. It's sometimes called the Texaplex, as it is there, otherwise as the Texas Triangle. So thinking about that, and thinking about the year 2030, we have to, as Kesha was emphasizing, return to the kind of thinking that it was exemplified by the 1968 Texas Water Plan, which was voted on in 1969 because there had to be a couple of amendments to implement the plan. It wasn't like the whole plan was being voted on, but you had to have a couple of amendments. And the amendments, that is one vote, lost for the entire state by 6,000 votes. In other words, the Texas Water Plan wasn't some crazy cockeyed idea out there in the middle of, somewhere. This was the Texas Water Plan backed by Governor John Connally, supported by Republicans and Democrats. And I swear, if it wasn't for the Vietnam War and the pessimism that came with it, it would have passed. But that 6,000 votes was all that prevented it from passing. Of course, we would do things differently now. Time and so on, things change. But nonetheless, the Texas Water Plan is the kind of thinking that we've got to return to. And it also reflects the fact that you've got to approach this from the top down. It's pointed out, I'll just mention it very briefly, the American Society of Civil Engineers, who we've had a chance to carry on a dialogue with some of their members and some of the people involved in this proposal. They just released a week ago a program, their outlines of a program for Texas for flood control, and in particular. And I want to mention also the Texas Water Development Board is within roughly a week is releasing the first statewide flood plan that's ever been done. I mean, a flood survey, right, of the entire state, the outline of the whole state from the standpoint of flood control and what needs to be done. And that's going to be very important. But just to read from the American Society of Civil Engineers report, Texas has been exemplary in water supply planning. I wouldn't go that far. With the development of the state water plan, which is updated on a 5-year cycle by regional stakeholder groups under the administration of the Texas Water Development Board. However, no such statewide planning framework exists for flood risk management planning. Okay? So if you're thinking about Harris County, you're thinking about a little more broadly the southeast Gulf Coast area. You've got to take into account, you've got to look at the watersheds. As the American Society of Civil Engineers report indicates, you've got to take into account the watersheds. You're not dealing with just water in Houston. You're talking about rivers that run through it. Right. It's also the case that there's no levee safety program in the state. This is all, various districts and so on. And, it's like, the mud districts and the rest of this. It's completely chopped up. And so their report says, okay, the planning regions, there's, I'll say, 16 regional planning districts in the state under the Texas Water Board, starting with every local water district, little planning group. They have their own, whatever, you get a bunch of people together or whatever, you can form a group. And then they build up piecemeal this program, which then is cobbled together into the Texas Water Plan every 5 years, Texas State Water Plan. And then through SWIFT, for example, which is could be a very useful vehicle and is a useful vehicle, the state provides leverage lending, a certain form of credit, to help finance projects. But the decision-making process is this cobbling together of all these individual decisions into something general. And out of the whole plan, only 10, 15%, 20% of the projects actually listed in this Texas Water Plan will ever get implemented in any given 5-year cycle. So, you know, it goes beyond just the question of the need to take into a watershed approach. We actually have to return to a top-down, statewide directed program. And I think that's something that's very notable about the Texas Water Development Board coming out with this flood survey that's going to be coming out in about a week. We'll have to see what the actual content of it is. Go on to the next slide. And this is just the population growth based on different projections. You know, with migration, without migration, and so on and so forth. Go on to the next. Okay, so the Ike Dike. This is actually the system that's utilized, or part of the system that's utilized in the Netherlands. And as you may know, this is being carefully studied. You can go to the Ike Dike website. Just put in Ike Dike. I mean, you'll come up with a website up at Texas A&M, Merrill and his group. And we have several different proposals for exactly how this will work. But the idea is, as I think most people here in this room know, in terms of hurricane protection, surge protection, and so forth, the point is to build a spine, a land barrier along the coast. Dr. Cooper showed some earlier reports, Army Corps of Engineers reports, I think, actually, done back in the 1990s. I think those were diagrams were from, I'm not sure. But I don't recall exactly, but the point is you got to build this spine and you got to extend it. Really, you got to go down to at least Corpus Christi, because we know where Harvey came in, right? So you can't just stop at Galveston Island and basically chuck the rest of the state south of Galveston Island and say you're on your own. You've actually got to, you've got to have a full system. But you've got to have entry points for ships. And there's different ideas, a barge gate, there's a vertical lift gates, different ideas that are variations on this proposal. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers just released $3.9 million for this, but this is going to build, something like a fifth, I would say roughly, of what it's going to cost. I'm going to quickly go through here and try to give you an idea of the costs that are involved. So in terms of the Ike Dike, with the spine and the gates and so forth, something like this, for example, to allow ships into the ship canal. I mean, think about it, if you're not already aware with it. If you've got a 30, 40 foot flood surge, and that comes up the ship canal, there goes the entire petrochemical industry. There goes, hundreds of thousands of lives. And that would be a direct hit from a Category 4, not even a Category 5 hurricane. A direct hit on Houston, coming in Galveston and moving inland. So you've got to take this seriously, finally. And of course, it's named after Ike for a reason. So you're talking about somewhere, I'd say, between $15 and $25 billion. 3.9 billion, you get the idea of what that is as a fraction. That money's going to be spent up in the Beaumont, Port Arthur area. That's good, they need it. Building down from there. But it's only going to go a small way. That's what's been voted up so far. But we're going to need something on the order of 15 to 25, and I would say on the high end, because these things always take more than you think they're going to take. And you got to do it right. You're going to build this thing once. And if you try to chisel it, if you don't build those berms high enough, people on the other side are they're gonna take it, right? So you got to do this right. And again, this is this question of this budget cutting mentality has got to be thrown overboard. Okay, let's move on here. Okay, that's an example of a barge gate, which is what is being recommended, at least by some of the specialists, for coming into the Galveston Bay through the what's called the boulevard entrance there. And In other words, it would be one gate that would swing out. It's kind of a barge, but it's also underwater. But underwater, it's honeycombed, so the water flows through it. But then it comes up above the water level, very high above the water level, to serve the purpose of stopping the surge. That's the idea. Go on to the next. All right, here's the basic problem we've got. This is a topological map of Texas, and you can green is the lowest height. We're about 50 feet above sea level here in Houston, for example. Go on to the next. These are the major rivers. Sorry for the way that came out, but those are the major rivers, and note where they're all flowing. They're all flowing down to the Gulf of Mexico, right? Go on to the next. Trying to move through this quickly. Now, north, if you go up above Austin, what you see down there in the lower right-hand side is Austin on the map. Up above there, you've got the Lower Colorado River Authority dams, LCRA dams, and you got a whole nest of them up there, one on top of basically the other. And it's the system as a whole that protects Austin and points south. Interrupt me at any point, Hal, if you want to add things. Okay. Okay, yeah. I was getting a bad neck trying to look at all your slides too. Go ahead, move on to the next here. Okay, so if we start at Toledo Bend, which is on the Texas-Louisiana border, so from where you're sitting, it's over here, right? It's all the way over on the border, up around Tyler and Longview and in that area, but right on the border. It's the largest, Toledo Bend is the largest reservoir in the South. It's huge. And it's largely unutilized. And it is a reservoir. That is, its primary function is for flood control on the Sabine River. Now, if you remember, there was a lot of flooding on the Sabine River down, they got hit down by the coast, right? With the water that they had to release from that dam. Even though it was a flood dam, they had to release a lot of water. Well, originally, there were plans for 4 dams on the Sabine River. The Toledo Bend was the largest, but there was one shown there, what is it, Ben Mere, or Bon Mere? Just south. And that was to catch the overflow from the Toledo Bend and stabilize the flow moving south. And that was going to be a large dam. That was going to, where Toledo is about 1 million acre feet, that was going to be about 400,000 acre feet. And then there were going to be 2 above Toledo Bend. So in other words, what we're talking about here is the need to build a lot more reservoir capacity, reservoirs being for flood control. They can also then be utilized for water as a water source. You've got to clean the water and so forth, but nonetheless, obviously all of these dams have multiple uses. The Texas has about, now it's, I think it's 188 or 189 major dams and reservoirs in the state of Texas. Reservoirs in the broader sense of for water as well as for flood control. So we could have built these, and we didn't. Okay, and this is what you'll see as we move down. Sam Rayburn. You can move on to the next. Well, that's jumping ahead. That's them moving down here into the San Jacinto River Basin and into the greater Houston area, reaching up into Montgomery County and so on and so forth. But just quickly, the Sam Rayburn Dam, which is the second largest as you move west and a little bit south. The Sam Rayburn Dam, well, there were going to be at least 3 other dams built in that area. Dam A, the Rockland Dam, and the McGee Bend Dam were going to be built, if I have it correctly. There was a total of 4 dams. Sam Rayburn was built. So 3 more dams. Again, if you remember, again, a lot of flooding because there had to be water released out of Sam Rayburn, right, because of the massive torrential downpours and the collection of water behind the dam. And it had to go somewhere, or there was a question of this structural stability of the dam, the integrity of the dam. So then we move on down to Lake Livingston. And then on to let's just move on to the, we'll go back to the one before there. This is interesting. I put this up. This is from the 1957 San Jacinto River Authority plan. In 1957, if you can see the little red marks on that, those are all the proposed dams that they were planning at that time were going to get built. A few of them were combined kind of in the upper left central. They became the Conroe Reservoir and Dam. But most of the other dams were not built. And if you see down on the lower left-hand side, you'll see Cypress Creek. And they planned 2 dams on Cypress Creek. This is in 1957. Okay? So again, we're talking about, we knew. This goes back to the question of knew or should have known. I mean, in terms of the question of honesty and approaching these things from the standpoint of what needs to be done. So go on to the next. I mean, this is what you're looking at. When you're talking about all the water that, quote unquote, flooded, it wasn't just 39 or 40 or whatever it was, 50 inches that fell in any one place. It was that it wasn't just falling where you were, it was following, way up north from where you were. And then, from up north, it was then coming down these rivers, right? These watersheds. And these are just figures on the amounts coming down on these peak flows during Hurricane Harvey. Move on to the next. Okay, now, back to Houston itself. I think this has become rather famous now. This is the 1940 engineering, Army Corps of Engineers map for Houston in 1940. And this was their plan. The population of Houston was 400,000 people at that time. 400,000 people, all right? And this is what they wanted to build. Now, on the left-hand side there, you'll see Barker and Addicks. Those were proposed. Again, these Army Corps builds virtually all of the flood control dams in the country, and certainly in Texas. All right, and these were for flood control, Barker and Addicks, and those got built. But note that there's canals. There's a canal on the north side, running on over to the San Jacinto, and then there's a canal on the south side, running on over, right? And these canals would empty. Ultimately into Galveston Bay, right? That's where this water would go. Well, those canals were never built, but the Army Corps was saying, well, we need them, and we're doing this in 1940. And you'll notice up on the upper left-hand side, I mean, it's well known, it's been Congressman McFall, among others, has made a point of this. In the upper left-hand side, McCall, rather, excuse me. In the upper left-hand side is you have the Cypress Creek levee as proposed then, where now there's talk about a dam, building a dam. But let me remind you that that dam is not, it hasn't been surveyed, the land hasn't been purchased, on and on and on. And as is pointed out, even by the Harris County Flood Control District, is that while we could consider, seriously, this should be considered a dam on Cypress Creek, there also are proposals, this is stated by the Harris County Flood Control District, there's proposals to build dams on the San Jacinto up in Montgomery County. In other words, these feeders into the San Jacinto River that were proposed and were intended to be built back in 1957 by the San Jacinto Authority then, are now, in one form or another, roughly, I mean, these things change, obviously, but nonetheless, you get the idea, we've come full circle. We're going to have to build a lot more reservoirs. So you're talking about, in terms of reservoirs, you're talking about a $500 million a crack, at least, with land acquisition and so forth. You can imagine that can climb pretty quick, particularly these days. And so, you just add them up. add them up on these rivers, starting with the Sabine and the Neches and the St. Angeline, and then you go on over to the, we'll just move on over to the San Jacinto, and then you got the Brazos, where again, they want to build 9 more dams on the Brazos River. And you got a lot. I think there's at least 11 on the lower Brazos. Anyway, they want to build more dams, at least 8 or 9 more dams there. So that was before Hurricane Harvey hit. So you're talking about, if you just use $500 million per crack, you get the idea that if you build 20 more of these dams, you're pretty certain talking about a lot of money, right? You're talking about $10, $15 billion. And that's what we need. Because Harris County Flood Control District is not going to manage the water coming down these rivers. Not the San Jacinto, but also the Brazos, right? And Beaumont and all the other cities in the Gulf are not going to manage locally a problem which is bigger than they are. And it's coming from outside their area. There's talk about building a wall, you can't build a wall here and stop this water. I mean, they talk about jacking up homes. What are we going to do? Jack up the whole city of Houston? So, we got to, let's move on here. So then you have the city of, you get to Harris County, and of course within it the city of Houston. And I'm trying to move through this quickly here. But Harris County, okay. How much money do you think Harris County Flood Control District spends a year, has been spending a year? For operations and for capital improvement. That is, digging ditches, widening bayous, and so forth. $120 million a year. Wow. Total. $60 million for operations, $60 million for capital improvements. Okay, that's it. And they've been doing that for years. That's the official figures. I'm not making that up. So that's, first of all, I think that's just really important to have in mind. Because you want to talk about chiseling, right? Now, now Harris County, or the Harris County Flood Control District, has $500 million worth of debt, in bonds, bonded debt. And with interest, that's about $800 million in debt. And you're spending $60 million a year on capital improvements. So, to me, that's an inverted triangle, right? But I'm not blaming anybody for that in terms of anybody at the Harris County Flood Control District. But I'm saying this is nuts, and we got to work our way out of it, and not by budget cutting. Obviously, we got to do the opposite of that right now. Now, in terms of the bond issue, I want to make this point, and then one more other point on the Harris County Flood Control District in terms of the straitjacket in which they're operating. The $2.5 billion bond issue, which will be voted on Saturday, and I plan to vote for it. I'm a homeowner. I plan to vote for it. I'm a homeowner in Houston, in Harris County. I'm planning to vote for it. It will increase. Okay, this is the Harris County Budget Officer, Bill Jackson. The bond funding measure, if it passes, will increase the Harris County Flood Control District's available capital funding from $60 million for capital improvements, right? That's where it is now. That's where it's been for years, okay? To about $100 million. So $2.5 billion, right, is going to increase the capital improvement budget of Harris County Flood Control District by $40 million a year. It also will buy homes that are in the floodplain. It'll do other things. But in terms of capital improvements, that's what Harris County Budget Officer Bill Jackson states. That's the estimate of what it will do in terms of capital improvements. Now let's measure that. 100 million. I mean, at least that's an improvement. Right? But here's what the Harris County capital improvement program that they were proposing. This was for fiscal year 2017-2018. It was issued June 20th, 2017. So this is before Harvey, right? This is June before Harvey. The Flood Control District recommends an annual funding stream of at least $200 million, which would allow the district to, this is the capital improvement, they're saying. We recommend $200 million a year, which would allow the district to accomplish its mission of flood risk reduction over the next 60 years. Of a 4%, that is 25-year level of protection. Let me back up and read the paragraph because it probably just makes it clearer. Excuse me. This is 3.8 in the Capital Improvement Program Annual Review. A community approach to flood damage reduction is a function of the level of risk and overall cost the community is willing to accept. In other words, are you willing to play Russian roulette? They're not proposing that, but they're saying, hey, read between the lines here. What are we trying to tell you? The investment in excess of $12 billion is necessary to raise our flood damage reduction system to an overall 4% 25-year level of protection. And $25 billion is necessary for a 1% 100-year level of protection. Now, 100-year level of protection, remember, we've just had 3 500-year storms in a row. Okay? So they're saying, look, if you even want to get the whole area up to 100-year, flood, 100-year level of protection, we need $25 billion in capital improvements. And then they go on to say that if you gave us $200 million a year, not 60, right, and not the 100 now that's discussed, but if you gave us $200 million, this would allow us to accomplish the mission of flood risk reduction over the next 60 years to the 4% 25-year level of protection. It'll take us 60 years to get there, but then we'll give you, basically a 25-year level of protection. Wow. So in other words, the figures here. So then put the 2.5 billion in that context. So you're talking about the need of, a 2, 3, 4 times that level of investment to actually, more probably, to actually get up to a 500-year floodplain level. Now, can you do that? Okay, so moving on to the next slide. This is that review I was quoting from, just to show you that it's real, I guess. Anyway, go on. I had to dig and dig and dig to find, once you found it, you say, oh yeah, I should have found that all along, but it takes, so these are the flood plains, and move on to the next one, and this is where this dramatizes the effects of 100-year and 500-year floodplain levels. Go on to the next. Now, could we get to a 500-year floodplain protection level by widening and deepening bayous and our creeks, and ditches? I have a hard time thinking that would be possible. Just practically. What about tunnels? Now this is, where you start to think big. It's another feature of this situation that we haven't touched on yet. And I think it's very important to consider. Right now in Washington, D.C., you have a major flood water. It deals with flood water, but also sewage, sewage overflow and so forth. For the Anacostia, or is it Anacostia? Anacostia and Potomac rivers, and is being done with a massive tunnel project, which is, it's well underway. I mean, the Anacostia tunnel is completed, and you now have the northeast boundary portion. It's really a portion of the Anacostia. It's the final portion of that is being built. And then I believe the Potomac tunnel has already been built. So the whole system, these are huge underground tunnels, 23 feet in diameter, each of these tunnels. Move on to the next. This is the, I always forget the term for it, tunnel boring machine, TBM. This is the TBM for the Anacostia River project as it was being lowered down because the tunnels are dug out 100 feet below the surface. Okay? So they're lowering it down there. Okay, next one. Just to get, this is the one that's building the northeast boundary tunnel. They named it Chris. I don't know the story behind that, but it's named Chris. But that's the size of it. If you see the size of the people, you get, that's why I put it up there. Go on to the next one. And that's Chris. It's now been set down, and it's going to go to work in the next weeks. I don't know the exact schedule. So just to give you a comparison, the soil that you're working with there in the Washington D.C. area, at least can be compared to what you would be dealing with here. It's low. You're already basically down at the sea level, and you're going down 100 feet. You could go down 200 feet, but the point is you're going down at least 100 feet. And from that example and other examples, we know that it would cost roughly $100 million a mile to bore these tunnels. So these tunnels are the building of these tunnels is well, I'll just quote, not that he's always right, but Steve Costello, who's now the water czar, I guess you could call infrastructure czar for the city of Texas, not the Harris County Flood Control District, but for the mayor's office. Steve Costello, the former city councilman, he said, "We're trying to lower the risk. We're never going to be able to totally eliminate the risk." This is the old plaint. You'll never stop the flooding. Okay, but what he says, well, a tunnel system quite possibly could eliminate the risk. And then he's later paraphrased saying, well, at least it could give us 100-year storm production level in every major channel. Now, the thing I would add is, well, why? Now, you could build the tunnel. There's the Harris County Flood Control District is doing a study now. They've it's costing about $400,000. It'll be out in October. It's a preliminary study on what it would take, what would you be talking about in terms of building a tunnel system under Houston to move water. And I think the primary thing that's being talked about is moving water out into Galveston Bay. All right? Well, if you're going to do that, why not move that water down towards Freeport? Why not move that water to a canal? I mean, tunnel out of the urban area, right? I mean, it saves money. You're not tearing everything up that you've already built. We do that enough with our streets, with our street improvements. So tunnel underneath, get out of the urban area, right, immediately. Then you can go to a canal. This dovetails with what Dr. Hal Cooper was presenting in terms of a canal on down the coast, not on the coast, but inland from the coast. Start moving water south, down towards the Rio Grande, down to where they need water. And then from there you can pump it. It's going to cost you money, but you can pump it to where you need it, even up to the Permian Basin for cities and so on and so forth. So that the water is not wasted. It doesn't just go out into the Galveston Bay. You'd have to treat it. You know, you couldn't, you know, you'd have to have storage facilities, reservoir basically, or retention, detention ponds, areas where you'd have to hold large amounts of water probably to allow it to get treated and then moved south in the canals. You can use canals because, you know, things don't freeze down here. So, so that's cheaper than tunneling all the way to Rio Grande, you know. But you could do this. So you're talking about, you know, 20 billion for a tunnel, several tunnels. You can, you know, you're talking about $100 billion. In other words, you're quickly talking about for an actual program for not just Harris County, but the Gulf Coast region. You're talking about at least several $100 billion. But if you're looking at it from the standpoint of the Texas Triangle, and you're talking about building out now the equivalent of the TVA that's going to give you the platform, the infrastructure platform of the future that's going to provide water for the future within the Texas Triangle and beyond it to the west, this is what you need to spend now. And if you stop thinking about it from the standpoint of spending money, first of all, if you think about it from the standpoint of training up a new workforce, our youth that don't have jobs, right? We're playing games on their, you know, their phones and whatever else, you know, and they're 30 years old and they're living at home with their parents. Here's a future, okay? We can train up a new workforce, and we got a lot more to do in terms of high-speed rail and all kinds of other projects, right? So we can move the country forward. We can move Texas forward, and not just forward, but up, right? So this is, you know, at least the sketch. I hope I've given you a sketch of a future that we can create. Now, in terms of the financing, let's move on to the financing really quickly here. Okay. And this is just to underscore, this is, go back one. The American Society of Civil Engineers last year put out their infrastructure report card, which, as I recall, comes out every 5 years. And go on to the next. This is nationally. This is their aviation. What's the infrastructure of the United States? D. Bridges, C+. I think they're being too good, too nice about that. Dams, D. Drinking water, D. Energy, D+. You can go through the rest yourself. You get an idea of this. They're talking about maintaining the existing infrastructure. They're not trying to say, well, this is what we need for the future. They're being very conservative, and they're just saying, look, this is what we really need to do. If this is the least we need to do, and this is really what, you know, we're debating on here. If you want to get out of my class, if you're sick of me as a teacher, this is, you know, you got to come up to this level, okay? So, okay, so go on to the next. Okay, so the American system of economics is not what we have today. And I'll go through this quickly in terms of hopefully the key concepts as opposed to the particulars. Alexander Hamilton created the first national bank of the United States. He did that as Treasury Secretary. He did that by 4 reports to Congress, which caused Congress to support him and support the conceptions that he presented. And he reorganized what was a country that was virtually entirely bankrupt from the war, IOUs all over the place, and he took all those IOUs, including IOUs from states, because he said, okay, well, we're the government now, so all these various states issued IOUs during the war to support their militias and so on. Well, we'll take that debt in too. Come on in, and we'll pay you back with notes. These will be interest-bearing notes from the National Bank, or you can take it in land, because we got a lot of land here, and we'll deed you land, you know, owned by the government, right, unoccupied land, and so forth. There was other options. But what this, so all of these bonds and IOUs and so forth were taken in by the Treasury, and they became part of the working capital. The U.S. government put in another roughly $1 million by hook or crook. It was kind of a funny deal that they worked out, but they managed to do it on the books anyway. And so the bank was capitalized, and the banks began issuing credits for projects. road projects. They lent, in terms of that bank, the First National Bank, they lent to companies. They lent to merchants, all kinds of things. And they had a board of professionals, businessmen and so forth, people that knew the industry, and they set up branches in different parts of the 13 colonies, or what had been the colonies, the 13 states, to help them make decisions on this, and for them to make decisions, which they would then support. And so a country that was virtually bankrupt began issuing credits, and these credits, which were interest-bearing, and could be redeemed in silver or gold, silver or bullion, circulate as good as gold. They were accepted as cash. They were, in that sense, the first greenbacks in the United States. And they circulate. And so a country that was bankrupt and there was no liquidity suddenly had liquidity. But the money was going out in the form of earmarked credits for projects that were productive in nature, that would build up, the sinews of the nation. And it did, very, very rapidly. Go on to the next slide here. Lincoln went back to this policy. That was the greenback policy. At the time of the Civil War, New York and London would not lend to the administration. You got to give us gold. You want us to lend you money? You got to give us gold up front. They wanted to just, take whatever gold there was, and there wasn't a lot. They wanted to take it out of the United States. So Lincoln went to issuing currency, which on one side were green, and therefore they became known as greenbacks. And they were good for paying debt, good for paying taxes. They were legal tender, and because they were issued by the U.S. government, with the backing of the U.S. government, they were accepted. Right? They paid for guns, they paid for ammo, they paid for factories, for rifle factories, and food supplies, and so on and so forth for the army. But also, indirectly, they built the Transcontinental Railroad. Indirectly. I mean, this was part of the overall process. We were creating wealth where wealth didn't exist. We were putting men and labor and their creativity in motion, and they were creating and building. And that's why the Civil War was won by the North, so-called, as opposed to the so-called South. Go on to the next. Another example to get at this idea of credit is the moonshot. Now, you've got some people who still think we never went to the moon. It was all staged in Hollywood. Okay, I can't deal with that argument here. I can't deal with that argument. But assuming that we went to the moon, which I'm sure we did, right? We had people at the time saying, why are we spending the money in space? We should be spending the money right here. Right? And then, why should we give our money to Austin, to the state of Texas? We should spend the money right here in Houston. And then we have we should spend the money right here in the neighborhood. Why should we give the money to the people downtown? Right? And then you get the politician who said, why should I give you the money? Why should I help you out? This money's for me. I'm for sale. Right? And so you just have a me, right? It's the me generation. That was what it was in the 60s and 70s. That's the boomer generation. So it's all about me, right? As opposed to the other. What did the space program? We didn't spend the money in space, We spent it here, but it wasn't the money, right? It was that we had a country which had a lot of potential. We had a huge youth population, right? The boomer generation was just growing up, right? Was coming of age, going to college, etc., etc. That was just beginning to happen. There was Sputnik, and so that was used as a promotion device, fine and dandy. And so we said, Kennedy, President John F. Kennedy, advised by, among others, by Eleanor Roosevelt, who was still alive when he announced his presidential campaign, he announced, not that I think Eleanor had anything directly to do with this, but he announced, we're going to the moon and we're going to go there within the decade. Right? Now we got at least $10 back, minimum. I mean, we're still getting a multiplier effect for those investments, so it's many-fold more than that. But we got at least $10 back for every dollar we invested in the space program. You know, you didn't have to work for the space program to get that payoff. You got the payoff. You know, if you go into a hospital or your parents go into a hospital or something, you're getting a payoff because of the equipment they have there. You know, from computer chips, you name it, on through materials and so forth. We have all kinds of capabilities. We don't necessarily use them in the right way, but we have all kinds of capabilities we never had before. And therefore, the potential productivity is a multiple. So in that sense, the space program was a credit policy. The government was saying, we're going to spend this money, you know, we're issuing these credits. These contractors are getting, you know, these projects. You're going to build this, you're going to build this. We, the government, we're going to guarantee that they have to meet certain standards. We're not turning it over to SpaceX. We're setting the standards. We're contracting to you, but you've got to come up to our standards, you know? And after a few loss of lives, you know, those standards became tougher, at least up until a space shuttle. So we did that, and the whole private sector prospered as a result. The U.S. economy boomed, and we educated a generation of engineers and scientists, in particular, in that process. So I think that's an extremely important example. Maybe just finally, this is a quote from an economist in 1810. His name is Robert Hare, H-A-R-E. He was a Hamiltonian, a follower of Alexander Hamilton's economics. But he's writing in 1810. And this is just to get at this idea of credit. Under a strict system of law, credit is preferable to money. The man who enjoys the one has nearly an equal facility with him who commands the other in the purchase of materials for trade or manufacture. But the stimulus to industry or exertion is very different in the two cases. The mechanic who has $100 can live without work so long as it lasts. This is in 1810, so a mechanic is not your car mechanic. I mean, maybe that too, but you know, this is a broader term. He may spend the whole or part in his pleasures or for his sustenance, and may work proportionally less. But the mechanic who can command credit to the amount of $100 has nearly the same capacity to earn money as the other, but his privilege will not sustain him in idleness or dissipation. It can only be of use to him through the medium of industry. That is, he's got to use that credit for the purposes specified, right? It's a credit. Prone in common with all substantial and hereditary wealth to subside in channels rather ample than numerous, the precious metals flow through a country in large streams which carry out as much as they bring in and contribute more to partial magnificence than to general fertility. While credit, springing up in innumerable small created rills, streams, diffuses a fertilizing influence throughout every region. That's the concept of credit as opposed to money. You know, in other words, money can be different. Money, if a bank buys or issues or makes money out of a collateralized debt obligation, you know, at the end of the day, you know, it paid in money and it got money back, and it's still money. But if as an example of the Tennessee Valley Authority, if you invest in building dams or in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation financing refrigerators and electrical lighting systems and power stations in the Tennessee Valley Authority region, allows farmers lighting that allows him to multiply his labor as a dairy farmer or in other activity, I mean, running a machine shop on the side, all kinds of activity. It's being able to read at night, and the other reasons given in that short video. That's not the money that's produced as a result of the Tennessee Valley Authority project and the wealth it created was not the same money that went into it. Right? You've transformed the productivity of the nation. Each dollar then buys more, or the same can be bought for less, because you've increased the productivity of labor. So that's what can be done. Go on to the next, very quickly here. And the next generation of science, such as fusion energy, can be the next generation, the next wave of breakthroughs in terms of energy shortages. Go on to the next. Okay, go. We know Glass-Steagall. Derivatives, that's the bubble that can pop. I mean, this is a few years old, but just, J.P. Morgan is sitting on over $80 trillion worth of derivative bets. When that blows, a lot of that's going to be self-canceling, but, the Federal Reserve and so forth are not going to be able to bail it out. Okay? This is the flow chart, a basic, simple flow chart of a national bank. If we create a national bank, or you could call it a national credit institution, or you could call it an infrastructure bank. If the federal government today implements Glass-Steagall, goes in and starts sifting through the bank records and writing off the derivatives contracts, what you're going to salvage out of the banks that now exist, Wells Fargo, B of A, and all these banks, your money deposited in these banks didn't stay here in Houston; it went to London. That's where it ended up, most of it. It's in the derivatives markets, all right? If you go in with Glass-Steagall and say, no, we're going back to commercial banking, you're a commercial bank, you're going to lend in the commercial markets, or we're writing this other crap off, it's gambling debt, then you're not going to have a lot of credit left in the country. So it's going to be critical that, like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, something like that be created in which the federal government is going to be the vehicle for creating long-term credits. Now, we're proposing a national credit institution, a national bank or infrastructure bank, if you will, not with PPPs and all that nonsense. We can come back to that if people have questions, but the point is, China's got over $1 trillion worth of U.S. IOUs. Japan has over $1 trillion. U.S. banks are sitting on over $1 trillion, which has nothing to do with what they need to be holding, as reserves. The point is, you could create a national infrastructure bank, a national credit institution, and you can say, okay, well, now we're open for business. We want to capitalize this bank. Put your money here. Put your money, move these IOUs, federal debt obligations, into the bank to capitalize this bank. And we'll backstop this with a revenue stream. Maybe it'll be oil and gas taxes, combined with the highway, the gasoline tax. And we'll dedicate that as a revenue stream into the bank. That'll provide for the servicing of the debt of these IOUs, right? And we're then going to issue credits against this capital for projects across the United States. We'll measure the amount of those projects based on what we know we can mobilize in terms of new productive potential. We're going to need cement mills, or cement plants. We're going to need more steel mills. We're going to need lots of different features, to build up the U.S. economy. Comparing with NABRI, in terms of into Central and South America, we got a big locomotive plant right up there in Fort Worth producing diesel electric locomotives. They already export them to the world, GE locomotive. We could export from here into South America and Central America. Caterpillar's got an engine plant over there near Seguin. It employs about 1,000 people, right? We could double or triple the size of that plant, exporting big motors going south. We could become a major export center out of Texas, and not just exporting car parts to Mexico, which is frankly what we do a lot of. And so we can have a complete transformation. This is how you finance the rebuilding of, this is how you build a TVA for the Gulf Coast region. This is how you finance it. You do it through a federal credit institution. You do it modeled in good part on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation that was headed by Jesse Jones right here from Houston through the 1930s and 40s. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So failure is not an option. Thank you.
I just wanted to conclude by saying that I hope you got a sense from this discussion that we have to start thinking with a sense of vision again. We have to have a visionary idea about the future, a can-do attitude, as saying that there's no problems that the creative human mind cannot solve. And just thinking about Brian spoke on the space program and the vision of people like John F. Kennedy. And I was thinking, as we were bringing up the Tennessee Valley Authority, of John F. Kennedy speaking, President Kennedy speaking 30 years on the 30th anniversary of at Muscle Shoals, Alabama, of the TVA program, about the vision that someone like Franklin Roosevelt had before him. And it was almost over a generation later that you had still the development of this vision really taking hold in the generation of President John F. Kennedy. And that's what we really have to get back to. And so, but as we're saying, it's not going to be with bottom-up local control. We have to have top-down. What Dr. Cooper went through in terms of looking at the mind of being able to put together such an extensive program, not just for a localized program for the state, but that everything, our entire nation, humanity as a whole, has to be seen as one interconnected unit. Everything that affects us here in the state of Texas is affecting around the nation and around the globe. And that's why, one, I want to encourage people, first of all, the platform that's in the back that is available for people to read really demonstrates that there's still people who have this visionary mindset and sense of leadership. My collaboration and association with a leading American statesman and economist who warned about, back in the 1960s and 70s, what would happen when we went away from the type of thinking in terms of going with the financial derivatives, going with the system of bailouts, going with the system of floating exchange rate system that has bankrupted our economy, has bankrupted the real economy, the physical economy. When we go away from physical production, and that collaboration with leading economist Lyndon LaRouche, we're seeing the results of our actions and our mistakes, and how this has devastated the future generations because we did not act. We allowed for Glass-Steagall to be repealed. We allowed for Nixon to come in with the takedown of the Bretton Woods system. And so my campaign, I am fully in endorsement of the idea of a campaign to win the future, that these programs that we just put forth today, things of restoring Glass-Steagall banking reorganization, going back to a national banking and credit system, a full-scale driver for productive employment through the advancements of the most advanced scientific and technological progress, fusion energy. That's how we're going to solve these problems. And so therefore, let me just go ahead and open it up, because I appreciate you guys staying here for this discussion, because I think it's absolutely urgent that we have this level of discussion. And if you want to see more of this, then I need you to take the message out there of my campaign for Congress, and to educate your communities, your neighbors, that there is a candidate, and there are people out there fighting for a real solution. So let me just open it up now and see if you have
Kesha Rogers for
questions.
Congress.